Without further ado, then we'll crack on. Just a point of order, if we could have everybody turn their cameras and microphones off at home, please. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, but we'll just have all the questions at the end to make it easier. And if you can turn your cameras off as well, so that for anybody watching the presentation from home, you're not being distracted by somebody getting attacked by their dog or children coming in and dancing in front of the camera. So welcome to this very first of our hybrid events for the Institute of Quarrying West of England branch. This is a bit experimental for us, so thank you very much for joining us. Please be patient. If there are any issues, please feed back at the end or during the call by putting it in the chat box if you're struggling to hear anybody, or you can't see the screen, or if there's anything else you're struggling with. And one of us, either Louise or myself, will do our best to solve those during the evening. And really that then just leads me to hand over and say we're very grateful to have Dr. Neil Humphries here with us, and he's asked me to keep the introduction fairly brief. However, I will say, Neil's got several decades of experience and lots of awards, and he's been very modest because he didn't want me to share that, but he is a very renowned scientist in this field. He's been well recognised with several publications, lots of industry awards, so we've got a very knowledgeable person presenting here tonight. And Neil was actually the instigator and author of the MAFF 2000 soil handling guidance, which many of you will no doubt be familiar with. And was also the instigator and author again for its replacement last year, published by the Institute of Quarrying, and that's what this presentation is going to be about tonight. So I'll hand over to Neil, and if you do have any questions, put them in the chat at the end, and we'll do a bit of Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Neil.
Well, good evening all, and thank you, Otto. As a member of the West of England branch, I'm particularly pleased to be invited to talk about the Institute's recently published practice guide. The guide is the replacement and successor to the government's MAFF 2000 guidance, which has been widely used by the quarrying industry for the past 22 years. It is endorsed by DEFRA by way of its agency Natural England and by the Welsh Government as the proper guidance to use, as prescribed by the updated web link on gov.uk. A little while ago, in April, the Institute launched a video on YouTube, which gives a brief introduction to the IOQ guidance, and hopefully you may have seen this, as well. I will not be repeating it here. Today, I'm going to pick out aspects and nuances of the new guidance that are relevant from a strategic planning and operational perspective. For the detailing of machinery operation, please refer to the methodologies in the guidance. I hope there will be workshops where we can discuss the good, the bad, and the alternative experiences and practices. There, I can say more about best practice approaches to the creation and reinstatement of specific land uses and various habitats. Help. Perhaps if I wave my hand to someone and someone presses a button, we'll move on. Meanwhile, eat your sandwiches, drink your drink. Right, okay. Well, most of, well, in fact, all of the illustrations you'll see tonight are actually taken out of the guidance. So hopefully it'll start putting some of those into context. Importantly, the guidance spans from the inception of the project to the end of its implementation, including its aftercare provisions. It involves the designers, specifiers and advisors in the project teams, as well as all those involved in the quarrying operations and their contractors, as well as planning authorities and regulators and consultees. It also has a training role by way of the Institute. And I think, just as a side comment, so those in operations need to be involved and work as an integrated team from the planning to delivery of the soil works, and not as separate parties as often happens. Yes. Sorry, we'll get the hang of it. We'll get the hang of it. It's a little monster, isn't it? The need for the new guidance has come about because soils are now recognised in planning policy terms as natural capital, and as such are important for the well-being and sustainability of our way of life, just as mineral resources are. In this context, soils are to be viewed to be of equal importance to the minerals they cover. And this is really a new way of looking at things and treating soils in mineral workings. Success. The policy applies to all soils for their safeguarding and sustainable management. It applies to relatively young, shallow soils equally, as well as old, deeper soils associated with agricultural land uses, and to mineral soils as well as peat wherever they are deemed to occur, and to soil forming materials where they are to be relied upon. All are to be restored to a high standard. No distinction is to be made between the high ALC grades 1 to 3A, i.e. the best and most versatile type, what we often refer to them as BMV, and the non-BMV ALC grades 3B to 5 agricultural soils, or any other soils. For BMV soils restored to non-agricultural uses, the expectation is their capability be restored as a land resource for the future. There will be schemes where the end product is open water, where there is no opportunity to restore land. Here, the recovery and reuse of the soil is to be agreed with the planning authority. And I suppose by way of comment, operations will need to consider that all soils are of special value. Non-BMV, non-agricultural soils, I say, are to be treated with the same level of care as agricultural BMV soils. They will need to ensure the engagement of a soil professional to advise the team and the operations from start to finish. And you'll hear this over and over and over again during what I'm saying tonight. I'm going to say a little bit now about choice of machinery and practice. Safety is the overriding operational consideration in the adoption of the guidance and deployment of machinery and practice. It is for the competent operator to decide. It needs to be conveyed and integrated into the design and operations from the inception of schemes. The safety reasons for not recovering soil resources or adopting the guideline practices must be made clear in the Soil Resource and Management Plan, the SRMP, which I will say a lot more about later. This is not new by way of comment and will already be the required practice. What we need to do is to communicate the scope for the safe use of machinery and practices at the planning as well as the work stages. Safety will determine and justify what is proposed. Operational costs are not a reason to dismiss the guidance and should not override the choice of machinery and handling practice. If cost is the deciding factor, this should be declared in the SRMP. Typically, cost factors include differential plant rates, amount of plant needed, combination of plant required, capability and work rates, availability. But they must also include the associated remedial work required. Total costs are not simply the price of the number of machinery units or amount or speediness of work involved by the adoption of a practice, but they are also the experience of the machine operators, the mode of working, i.e. whether it's progressive to avoid double soil handling, the occurrence of delays, and the costs incurred by additional remedial works. Operationally, this is by way of comment. For more realistic and competitive costings between machinery options and practice, we will need to factor into the cost analyses and budgets those remedial operations that are an integral part of the methodologies and practices that cause compaction. Whilst this is not new, the guidance makes it clearer by incorporating the actions required within the methodologies themselves. Say a little bit more about methodologies, choice of machinery, just to put them into context. The guidance provides methodologies for 2 combinations of machinery and 1 hybrid practice. The 4 handling practices for the stripping and replacement of soils. So the machinery operations to strip and replace soils are either an excavator and dump truck, or a bulldozer dump truck with excavator to load. The handling practices to strip and replace soils comprise of either the bed strip practice, or the windrow peninsula practice, or the modified layer by layer practice, or the hybrid practice. All these are shown and described in the guidance, so I shall not go into detail at this particular point. In the guidance, there are the excavator and bulldozer-based methodologies for soil storage, removal of non-soil artifacts, large stones, and for decompaction. Obviously, other machinery not directly handling the soils may also be needed to maintain access routes, so on and so forth. You may have seen that motorized earth scrapers have reappeared. These are not included in the guidance, but methodologies for their operation can be found in the MAFF 2000 guidance, which is still available on the DEFRA archive website. The choice and rationale for the machinery and handling practices should be given in the Srmp, which again I will say more about later. Sorry, I should have been showing you these slides. Those are the basic choices of machinery, and this one is where in the guidance it provides detailed operational methodologies for each machinery and handling practice and remediation measures to be deployed. These are provided as individual standalone sheets A2O, which can be distributed to guide contractors and machine operatives. Each methodology gives advice on the advantages and disadvantages and their suitability. There's procedures for determination of soil wetness and protocol for wet weather are included. Importantly, to avoid them being overlooked in the soil replacement operations, remedial measures are now integrated into each methodology for soil replacement. I'm going to say choice of machinery and practices and soil compaction. The new guidance is based on a risk-based approach where judgments by informed soil professionals who judge the significance of choices adopted and consequential actions required. And I will come back time and time again to this particular approach and the integral role that the professional soil scientist has to help you see your way through the guidance and its implementation. Well, operationally, soil compaction arising out of soil handling is the most commonly occurring condition, limiting the achievement of intended land uses and services on restoration. After safety, compaction is the main consideration in determining the methodology to use. Compaction is the compression of the soil structure form which determine its functional characteristics. This is primarily caused by the trafficking by machines over the soil material and when in bulk transit and storage. The degree and significance depends on the machinery used and handling practice adopted, but also the soil textural class and its wetness. Remedial treatment during and after soil replacement is possible, but the effectiveness is dependent on the capability and condition of the equipment being used and the soil being in a dry condition. Operational effectiveness is less certain than the avoidance minimization of compaction. There may be restrictions on implementation of effective remediation by ripping or digging, where the replacement soils are over inert backfill and situations like silt lagoons. By way of comment, the main operational considerations in most cases needs to be the avoidance and minimization of compaction for the certainty and cost-effective delivery of the intended land uses and services and their outcomes. All these slides that you'll now see are which may not be particularly clear, are taken from the actual guidance itself. So I'll make some general comments over them. So operational guidance is given as to the inherent risk of causing compaction through the choice of machinery and handling practice. The relative risk of compaction by the machinery and handling practices are shown in this particular slide, where the least risk, when soils are dry, is with the excavator, dump truck, and the bed strip practices combined. Hence, its often favoured status. The highest risk is with bulldozer dump trucks using the windrow, peninsula, or layer-by-layer practices, even when low ground pressure dozers are used. That might surprise some people, but it's actually a fact. Comment: operationally, the need for remedial work can be managed by selecting an inherently lower risk option. Here, the soil professional will be able to advise as to the risks and the consequences of particular choices and the restoration outcomes. So there's not a prescription that you must use one particular method over the other. It's a matter of what the circumstances are and what the risks are involved, and whether there is a consequence for the particular type of land use that is being aimed at. That's why you need professional advice. When soils are in a wet condition, all practices have a high risk of compaction. So irrespective of the, by way of comment, irrespective of the choice of machinery and handling practice, if handling wet soils, there will be remedial requirements. However, these may not be possible until later into the aftercare period, adding to the costs and uncertainty of achieving the restoration objectives, with the added risks of disruption and further damage. This slide is showing risks when soil storage is involved. So operationally, soil storage and mound height are major risk factors in soil compaction and can negate the advantages of the excavator dump truck and the bed strip practice. The better practice is the progressive operation when soils are directly placed. The scope for direct placement and rationale for storage should be given in the Srmp. Well, obviously, this is existing guidance, but it's very, very important guidance. This is this slide focuses on the different types of soils, the textures of soil from a textural point of view. Higher risk soils with low resilience to compaction, whilst in a dry state, include silty loams, heavy clay loams, organic soils, and peat. Moderate risk of medium resilience are medium clay loams and sandy clay loams. The lower risk soils of high resilience being the sandy loams and sand, but are still capable of being compacted, particularly when in a wet condition. Hence, all soils have a higher risk and a lower resilience to compaction when in a wet state. By way of comment, this is new guidance which indicates the risk of compaction due to the inherent soil properties, which can influence the choice of machinery and practice. Here, again, there is need for advice from a soil professional. This slide is to do with the risks to do with textures and obviously the practice combination. So operationally, the textural characteristics of the soil resources should influence the choice of machinery and practice as indicated in this slide. Where there are high-risk soils, should only be handled by, where there are high-risk soils, they should only be handled by the excavator, dump truck, and bed strip practice. whereas for the low-risk soils, other options can be considered. And again, the comment has to be the justification of the choice based on soil textural characteristics should be given by a soil professional and included in the Srmp. There may be circumstances when the guidance for soil stripping cannot be followed, such as the occurrence of archaeological artifacts. Here in this slide, only certain practices may be acceptable for watching briefs and investigations and recordings. In some cases, trafficking of the topsoil may even be necessary to protect the particular archaeological interest. Again, the justification for the choice should be given in the Srmp, which I'm going to come to shortly. The expectation is that soil compaction will be a result of soil handling using the bulldozer mediated practices and all options where the soils are in a wet condition. Decompaction treatment, as advised by the soil professional, should be deployed during the operations and or subsequently in the aftercare period. Again, they are to be dealt with in the Srmp. So to drive the point home, in summary, operational choice of machinery in practice, avoidance, minimization of compaction and soil wetness is the lowest risk strategy. The least risk practice, where safe and practical, is the use of the excavator and dump truck and the bed strip practice. Otherwise, there is reliance on the deployment of remedial actions which depend on the availability of effective equipment and dry soil conditions. Well, I've mentioned soil wetness quite a few times in the past few comments and deliverance. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more about that. Soil wetness in the guidance, it comes down to a managed approach. Soil wetness commonly exacerbates soil compaction during the handling with earth-moving machines and the practices used. It's important and significant operational matter, not only because of the consequences of compaction, but also the costs due to delays. Operationally, the management of soil wetness requires careful planning and flexibility. In the UK, soil wetness is largely seasonal, with the soil profile becoming dry in the summer and where there is vegetation. It varies geographically and altitudinally, and with soil textural structure, porosity, depth to the water table, topography, and including flood risks. Locally, it can be exacerbated by watercourses, ditches, and field drains. Historical regional soil moisture deficits and field capacity days provide indicative regional summaries and can be used to broadly plan soil stripping and replacement operations. For example, most of Devon is in climate area 1. Here, the topsoil with a low clay content, the potential for stripping is between mid-April and early October, whereas in Suffolk, in the drier area 3, with a similar soil, it would be late March to early December. Should a profile in Devon with a high clay content need to be stripped deeper than, say, 60 centimetres, the potential is between mid-July to mid-September, whereas in Suffolk, such a deep soil, it will be between late June to mid-October. Although in both cases, operations should be curtailed earlier in September to enable an adequate vegetation cover to be established before winter. While such data serves for generally planning, for field operations, they should not be relied upon, as we've experienced over the past 3 years, where we've had drier springs and wetter summers. By way of comment, this is also not new and should already be normal practice. However, it's probably the most difficult operational constraint to be confronted. It belies the need for foresight and flexibility in planning of resource extraction and soil handling operations. The soil professional can advise as to the risks due to soil wetness and the consequences for restoration outcomes. A long-established field-based soil method, well familiar to the quarrying industry, is to be deployed for determining actual soil wetness and manage the start and suspension of operations in concert with an established rainfall protocol to suspend and restart soil handling. These are to be applied to all operations of soil stripping, storage and replacement, and are incorporated into the methodological sheets in the guidance. Measures can be exercised to minimize delays due to rainfall events, such as the pre-installation of drains, maintaining transpiration of cover vegetation, and their sequential removal. However, in some circumstances, soils can be permanently saturated, and an alternative practice will have been agreed with the local planning authority during the planning process. Again, by way of comment, this is not new and should already be normal practice. The guidance integrates the protocols for and determination of wetness condition into the operational methodologies. It reinforces the need to determine soil wetness condition on an ongoing basis and being prepared to suspend operations when soils are in a wet condition. While soil professionals can train site operatives in field testing, achieving the desired outcome depends on the willingness to decree and maintain stoppages according to the guidance. I've mentioned the soil resource management plan now several times, and this is a key element of the guidance. It's a key document from an operational point of view. So I've referred several times to the soil resource and management plan. The SRMP is not new. It was devised by British coal operations as routine practice in the 1980s and was part of the 2009 DEFRA construction code, which is currently being revised. It has been adopted and incorporated into the new Institute of Quarrying guidance. The SRMP has a key informative role in the delivery of the intended after-use from project inception to site closure and aftercare involving all stakeholders. And you'll see this is exactly the same diagram as the guidance diagram shown in the first. So they're both the same thing and have the same fundamental role. You can't divide the two. It is to be the operational guidance for consented schemes, and it is to be reviewed and updated as a live document at least annually. Any necessary changes due to operational circumstances can be agreed with the planning authorities through the Town and Country Planning Act Section 73 process. Broadly, the function of the SRMP is to conserve soil resources and their functions and ecosystem and environmental services, to enable the delivery of the intended land use consistently and efficiently, and to ensure compliance with planning policy and consents. All schemes adopting the IOQ guidance are expected to have an SRMP, with the content agreed with the authority at the scoping stage of the planning application and submitted prior to planning determination. It should not be deferred, as commonly has been the case, to the operational stages of the scheme, and ongoing engagement with the planning authority and regulators during the planning consent process is advisable. All stakeholders in the operator's team need to be involved from inception to site closure in the management plan. It is important that those delivering the scheme are involved with the designers as to the choices of machinery and practices proposed to avoid subsequent changes that have often happened in the past. The SRMP should be enshrined in the soil handling contracts where the operation is outsourced. It's essential and expected that a soil specialist, either in-house or contracted in with experience of soil handling, is involved throughout, including the operational phases. Comment: whilst this is not new to the planning process, the SRMP is often not available at the operational ones. It's essential that the operational inputs are made in the formulation of the plan and the soil professionals are retained for their input at the operational stages. So in brief, the SRMP is to include the soil resource inventory, the soil and management handling plan covering restoration and aftercare, the scheme design including all the access routes, soil storage and other infrastructure, but importantly type of machinery and handling practice, giving the rationale for selection and deviation from the guidance, for example safety or archaeological or site circumstances, including the proposed operational rainfall and soil moisture limits, identification of the roles and responsibilities and lines of communication of all those involved, and proposed monitoring and reporting. Monitoring and reporting, the Cinderella practice. I was quite proud of that because it's actually quite true. Monitoring by a soil professional is an undervalued activity, but a crucial one and an integral part of the guidance in the SRMP. It provides the basis for any remedial actions needed and their efficacy in the subsequent aftercare period. In other words, sometimes remedial works may not actually be necessary, but you need someone who's competent to tell you that, so you don't have to expend your money and time doing it. It provides a factual basis for compliance and completion audits by the planning authority and oversight and regulation. It provides evidence base for the SRMP justifying the deployment of alternative practices and operational decision making, and provides the basis for improvement in efficiencies. Monitoring is often the weakest link in the whole process, and I often hear, why should money be spent on this? The mission is operationally short-sighted. It should be a component of the SRMP and mandated at the granting of planning consent. If you wish to use alternative practices, by monitoring, this actually will provide you the evidence that your alternative way of doing things provides and produces the end results. So don't discount it. It can actually play great dividends in your operation. Well, finally, getting to the end of it, operational focus and overview of key elements. Well, much of the guidance is not new, but what the Institute's guidance does, it integrates key issues, such as the involvement of the operational part of your business at the inception of the project to determine the actual machinery and handling practices. It plays a key role in determining soil resources and the importance to be given to them. It is important from getting soil professionals, their key role and their retention. While safety is an overriding consideration, costs should not, particularly when taking into account the need for ongoing remediation. I've said there are instances when good practices can be deviated from, archaeology, so on and so forth. Soil wetness, a major determinant of the risk of soil compaction and influence of choice of machinery and practice. This is probably the most difficult operational challenge to resolve. And again, monitoring should be part of the culture. So what I've done then is just to try and just summarize the key operational elements. Competent soil resource and management plan, key. Identification of soil resources, adherence to soil wetness protocols, lowest risk machinery combination practice, effective and timely remedial treatments, trained and experienced machine operatives, and retain professional advice and monitoring. So finally, thank you for listening. Apologies for my done use of for this device, and hopefully it didn't distract too much. We do value your feedback, so please tell us via the Institute's website, www.quarrying.org/soils guidance, of your comments, experiences, and ways in which you might be helped or supported in the future. So Otto, I've got there. I don't know if I've crossed the line early or late or.
You're slightly early, but I think that's absolutely fine. So thank you very much.
No chance.
Make it worth coming down here. I mean, I'm happy to start off with a question, and my first one would be, you know, after 20 years of essentially this guidance in its various forms, you know, how familiar in your view are the contractors and actually the teams out on site who are often doing this vital work and implementing the methodologies?
There is familiarity with the MAFF guidance that has been widely circulated. The challenge is going to be to get the new guidance equally circulated, and hopefully the Institute has got a plan. It has a plan, and that will take place. It is quite surprising, actually, how much the MAFF guidance was actually used. The weak link, as far as contracting side of things goes, has been on the training side. And I suppose my experience is that really you start off on day one on site, training the contractor how not to use a bulldozer, for example. They've been using it from a civil engineering point of view for a good number of years. It's a matter of undoing all that good training and getting to use the bulldozer in a very bad way to achieve the objectives that we actually need from a soil point of view. So again, I think this is perhaps where the Institute can actually play a significant function. What's interesting is that part of the steering group that was in place during the writing of this guidance, that there was representation from the contractor side of things.
Good.
So does that?
No, absolutely, yeah. I guess I was just quite conscious, you know, we do all this work and we've got the soil resource management plans, but how often does that actually carry down through to the person in the ground operating that machinery, which is obviously the crucial step. So yeah, that answers my question. Thank you. Have we got any questions in the room, first of all? Yeah.
That was an interesting talk. You talked rightly a lot about soil wetness. You didn't say anything about soil dryness. I've seen some. Well, I've seen one example of on a very windy day, some dry sandy soil being sent across the main road like a fog. And it wasn't just while the soil was being moved that there was a problem. After the soil had been placed, it still continued going. Do you have you covered that at all, or is there any methodology to, apart from saying stop moving it?
Yes, there's no guidance as specifically as to that, but it comes down to common sense. If you're causing a nuisance, and that the work either has to stop or that you've got to have something in place, watering system to quench the dust. Quite clearly, if the soil is too dry to move, and there are certain soils that will, as you say, will break up and just become literally a pile of dust, then you can't move them. And this is where a competent soil professional, they don't cost very much. There's the cheapest chips. Well, they were cheapest chips, and they can tell you right at the beginning of your project, at the project sort of thinking stage, what sort of materials you've got and what the issues that you might come across. Not leaving it, of course, to the contracting stage, which has often happened in the past. Then suddenly someone finds they've got a dry soil. What do we do with it? Well, you can't move it. You shouldn't be moving
it. They carried on because the contractor had to be there for a day and finish it in a day. Made a terrible mess.
Again, that comes down to the simple fact that with the knowledge, if someone is well informed about it, you can write it in the contract so that operation or action doesn't actually take place. It's all perfectly simple, isn't it? It's just being aware that and it's that knowledge and understanding, and
Yes.
Thanks. My question was with regard to and it follows on from John's, once it's in the stockpile, be it topsoil or subsoil, cover crops to prevent the degradation of the soil whilst it's in there. Are those recommendations for cover crops? We're all very used to seeing subsoils and topsoils covered in woolly thistles and docks, and I don't know, is there within the guidance a recommendation with regard to a cover crop?
No, there isn't. It's just that. Sorry, no, there isn't. But it's the guidance is simply that you need a vegetation cover put on it. Now that the detailing of that will come down to the local circumstances and the past experience, and that will have been agreed with the local authority during the submission of the various planning consents. That will have been specified, and if we've got woolly thistles and all those sorts of things on, that should have been also covered in the various conditions with the planning consent. Those sort of situations shouldn't really happen, and it's usually by neglect or something or other, which I can't say in public over the air.
Does that answer the question?
I think it comes down to the fact of ongoing management, and especially somewhere like the Mendips, where you've got soils in there for a very long time in storage. It's keeping that management of that soil.
Well, it all comes down to money, doesn't it? Sorry, did I say that?
I'm going to double check if we've got any questions on the chat. And if you are watching from home and you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. I can't see anything at the moment. Just while we have a couple more minutes for anybody to type. I mean, one for me really, especially with the kind of the biodiversity net gain index coming in, and potentially, land managers and stewards being paid. Do you think there's an opportunity for this to really take the forefront in people's minds in terms of actually, if they're relying on those the ecosystems and the carbon sinks that they're generating, they need to get the soils right. So do you feel that there's a bit more kind of interest and potential for people to really take this on board now?
Well, absolutely. Also, the aspirations will not be achieved unless there is more cognizance about the type of soils, the nature of the soils, and then the various handling practices. And from what I've achieved, my experiences over the last few decades, and that to achieve the sort of aspirational things, then you will have to look after and have knowledge about your soils and do the right thing in handling and so on. So that's the whole basis of it. That's the biodiversity is very much, if you like, the covering of the cake. The actual cake itself actually comes down to the soil materials that you're actually using and the way you do it.
That's great. Well, hopefully with the increased focus on that, we'll see people really paying attention to getting literally the foundations for that right. I'll just wander back. Any more questions from the room?
Just very quickly, with the advent of a lot of work within quarries getting sort of contracted out, and contractors tend to be used for multiple use, whether it be load and haul or muck shifting and your stripping operation. Quite often they'll try to do everything with the same equipment they've got. I just wondered if it was something that was specified they should be using sort of low ground bearing sort of tires and tracks, as opposed to some of the more rock suited ground engaging equipment. Is there a prevalence of them trying to use more specialized equipment, or just using the equipment they've got to do that particular task of moving soils?
By and large, you should be able to use the existing type of kit, and what it will come down to is usually often the size of kit. And I suppose in many operations in that you'll have the sort of 40-60 ton bendies when you perhaps should be using a 20-ton bendy, or you've got a 60-ton excavator and really a 20-ton excavator. it's not so much to do with the type of kit. I suppose it's just really to probably the size. There may be one or two very specialist situations, but even handling peat, there are operational ways that you can use standard kit to do the job. The key thing comes back to what Otto was sort of saying earlier on. It's having the knowledge of the operator. It's the mode of operation. For example, you talk about low ground pressure. Well, sometimes low ground pressure can actually cause more difficulties for you. To move the same amount of material and that, they have to move over the ground often more times than a standard piece of kit. And again, it comes down to really the knowledge of the operation and whether they're causing issues or not. But by and large, I would think standard kit and various practices perfectly satisfactory.
Yeah.
I suppose might make one comment. The deviation from that is probably the agricultural kit that's often deployed in the later stages of restoration. A reliance on agricultural kit, something that the British Coal Open Cast did with Ian Carroll and Brent Jones and that. They worked with Srmp equipment. And they upgraded an awful lot of kit, the ripping kit, the tines, the discs, so on and so forth. And it's actually a great shame that equipment isn't widely available. And there's a tendency for people to try and do some tasks using agricultural grade tractors and subsoils and things, and it's just so inefficient and ineffective. It's just beyond belief. So I think that's where we made the improvements 40 years ago, but it seems to have got lost in the haze of time. And that's where I think great stride. Well, that's where the effort and focus should actually be.
I can see a little bit of chat activities. I'm hoping that's more questions. Steve Cole, Alexander. Excellent. I think we'll learn for a bit next time. There's probably a better way of doing this rather than me running around. But got a question from Steve Cole online. Great presentation, thank you. How does this relate to the AWS and PAWS soils? This will help unlock some areas for mineral working. And if you could also elaborate on what an AWS and a PAWS are for those of us in the room who don't know.
AWS
and PAWS.
Sorry, Steve. Can you actually?
Ancient woodland soils and soils that have been previously ancient woodland soils.
Hot topic.
Yes.
Yes. What's the question?
Will they? Now, I mean, the presentation was great, and I think this is, what the IQ did and what you've done putting this together is fantastic because it's been long needed. But sites I've worked on have had porous soils on it, and we've had great problems with getting the planning through. And at that stage, we were effectively, using your guidance almost before it was designed, if you like. Do you think that the process with this new guidance now set in place, and that a lot of good messages in there, that cost can't be an issue? It's about preserving the soil because you can never replace it if you destroy it. Do you think that's going to help in planning situations with local authorities and landowners and the other authorities in terms of getting mineral working in areas which are often under those sort of constraints?
Well, in practice, Steve, yes, if you follow this guidance, it should help an awful lot because you will achieve the end result that you're hoping for. I think that's the crucial part of it. So it's a bit of a short answer to the AWS is ancient woodland soils. PAS is plantations on ancient woodland soils. That's what Steve's talking about. And this is simply a matter now that to get planning consent for those sorts of sites, which are incredibly difficult, and will be even more difficult with BNG and all that sort of thing that is now heading our way. That it's a matter of recovering soils. So yes, the recovery of soils, you are going to have to be kinder. You're going to have to be more considerate about the process that you will actually be using to recovering them. Quite clearly, compaction there is a major issue, in the same way that actually soil loss in those sorts of situations is an issue. You've got other issues that potentially are there in terms of drying out during movement and oxidation of our organic soil, so on and so forth. So there, a much more rigorous application, if you like, of the guidance, much more involvement of soil professionals. I think they have a great role in helping the industry get through. But the basic principles are in the guidance, are relevant.
Thank you.
Sounds like can be done in practice, but the politics might not be as easy.
Well, you know that we've got some of it done elsewhere.
Yes,
Yes,
it can
yes,
be done.
yeah.
Trying to convince the public that it's not be so easy.
Well, it's time. It takes time. We've got chat 5 now.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if I can.
There's another question here from Peter Wood. Do housing developers or road builders have to produce to the Srmp?
Yes, they will do, because the DEFRA now has put out a contract for the Good Practice Guide for Construction Sites 2009 to be upgraded. And what I understand is they'll use this guidance as the basis for that revised guidance. That should be probably out within 12 or 18 months.
Are you working on that one as well?
No. No, they're using mine for free.
Hopefully that answers your question, Peter, at home. I think you can now pipe up on your microphone if not. And that's probably drawing us to a close then. So if anybody's got any final questions, any more from the room?
Got one more.
Oh, yeah.
Is there
Right, it's probably okay.
Is there sufficient knowledge within the planning authorities with regard to soil? So we will undertake a soil recovery management plan, but actually do and will they understand what we've submitted?
That's a loaded question, isn't it? that's a radio 4 sort of 7:30 sort of question, isn't it? I suppose the answer is no comment. Natural England, the Welsh government, who worked on this new guidance and that, will make comment where there are important soil resources involved and advise the local authorities. Well, they don't have the equivalent like a biodiversity officer, for example, but knowledge and experience is freely available. All they have to do is to make contact with the British Soil Society, Soil Science Society, BSSSS, and there are a host of well-experienced soil professionals who will be able to give local authorities that advice. But, you know, advice and knowledge and experience is not short in this country, and there's a long history that goes back to the 1970s, and many of these people are still around who have had great experiences in all workings, so on and so forth. You know, Stuart McCrae is retired now, you know, for example, and many others. So the knowledge is there. It's just simply a matter that someone needs to make contact. But if the industry does a competent soil resource management plan, that should, with the backing of the competent soil professional, provide all that's actually needed. Sorry, hopefully that sort of gives you
Yeah, no,
a
that's
fine.
Right, I've got a question actually. Soil, obviously, sometimes you have excess soil. Certainly in our operation, we have to go back to limestone grassland, so we can't put the soils back again. When we finished using them, obviously my current intention is it will just be put back in the hole in the ground and used to bring back the original ground level. But should I be thinking, well, actually, this soil does have a value, and I need to be speaking to our local farmers to say, do you want extra topsoil to make their topsoil thicker? You know, how sort of valuable, how much should I actually be trying to get other people to use it, or is it just best chuck it in the hole, cover it with scalping so they can grow their limestone grassland and not a lot else on it?
It all sounds like heresy to me. So no, this is terrible practice, but you've got the issue of what the planning authority's view is, because under most planning conditions and that, you can't take soil off site.
Yeah.
It's very rare, unless it's specifically the consent is to provide that sort of material. So someone should be waving their arms around if the matter of soils are being put down the hole.
But that's been my only option, because I said the final surface is back to limestone grassland, which is just a clay scalping on top and then seeded. So the soil will be lost.
Sorry, this is heresy as far as I'm concerned. What sort of limestone sort of grassland are you actually thinking of?
Well, it's down in Dorset, so it's Dorset limestone grassland.
Yeah,
And that is
my neck of the woods.
yeah, and the stipulation is you just use a clay scalping material for finished surface.
So if you want a weedy calcareous grassland, not a proper grassland, calcareous grassland that I recognise as a grassland book, you know, if you. And that's certainly not the way you go about it.
Okay.
There is a tendency to, because people don't think they can control weeding and so on and so forth, is to get rid of topsoils.
Yeah.
Well, beware. You will not get necessarily a resilient calcareous grassland of the type that people aspire to, using that sort of approach. Yeah, you get lots of oxide daisies and all these photographics of nice sort of colours and things. That's no calcareous grasslands. The weedy, flowery sort of roadside verge things.
So it sounds like I need to go back to my soil expert and have a conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I live in Dorset, so give me a call.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm being a bit flirtatious at the moment. But that is a big challenge when it comes to this biodiversity net gain. There will be confrontation between practices that some people would like to do and what to do with the soils. Well, that somehow has got to be teased out. I think that is quite a big challenge going forward.
Currently it's farmland,
Yes.
which is being obviously growing crops for livestock, etc.
Yes.
And that's going to be lost in the area to limestone grasslands. There's a conflict there immediately between feeding people and biodiversity.
Well, can you look at the sort of mix of the soils and the distribution of things? Can you not use those soils for woodland?
Trees don't grow very well.
Well,
we need to
but scrub does.
Yeah, it's scrubbed.
Yeah, and things. And scrub is absolutely great for moths, butterflies, birds, and things. So yeah, you know, don't throw 1,000 of years worth of soil away. Or do what you might be able to arrange with the local authority, that if something else has to be restored somewhere else, that material can be used.
So I think of one example where we've done that at a site currently. Yeah, there's an excess of topsoil and we're sending it to another site to restore it where perhaps the topsoil wasn't necessarily managed properly, or we need that additional resource to achieve the restoration profile.
I'll come and have a moment there. Flowery.
Does the guidance cover monitoring the after use to make sure that the operation hasn't had a detrimental impact on the soil?
Only in principle. That's where that should be in the Srmp. This is that bit about monitoring and recording. It should be saying what needs to be done and how it's to be done, what has to be monitored, what certain physical characteristics or chemical characteristics and so forth. Clearly, there will be at least a 5-year aftercare period, or whatever it is, and the local authority should, which they often don't, should be then saying that they want some detail, and it's perfectly easy and possible to obviously monitoring whether you've got the product that you want and whether you need to do remedial action. This is not detailed. It doesn't specify. What I've tried to do in the guidance is not to specify things in absolute detail, because it will, in the range of the quarry industries and soils and so on, so forth, one size does not fit all. The key thing is to get a competent, an experienced advisor in who can determine for you what's appropriate, and also only what is necessary to achieve the end product. It's one of principle.
And what constitutes a qualified advisor? Because it sounds to me like you can potentially get an advisor that isn't going to give you the best advice. And does the planning authority recognise a certain type of qualification? Well,
what they recognise is that someone who's recommended by the British Soil Science Society, and they have they obviously have a list of people who are competent. You can go on their website. You can ask for an expert, so on and so forth. There's plenty of them to advise you on that. And that's the quickest and cheapest way of doing it, because they've experience.
That's great. Thank you, Mark, very much. Well, I think in terms of questions, we'll leave it there as we've hit 7 o'clock. Appreciate people might have other engagements and dinners to get to, and everybody here's got a long drive home. So if we could thank Dr. Neil in the usual way, which is very nice to be able to say this in a real round of applause. So